He earns $180,000, I earn $45,000, but he still demanded 50-50 split, left me with $200 a month for 14 months. One simple question I asked him across the table finally showed me his true face. The question I asked him was simple. I asked him if he thought this was fair. Not accusatory. Not loaded. Just fair. We were sitting at the kitchen table where we had split every bill for 14 months, the spreadsheet open on his laptop the way it was open every first of the month, the numbers arranged in the columns he had created with the precision of someone who had thought very carefully about a system that worked very well for exactly one of us. I asked if he thought it was fair, and he looked up from the laptop and he said, without hesitation, without any apparent awareness of what the answer was about to show me, fairness isn't about feelings, it's about equality. We each pay half. That's equal. He looked back at the screen. He adjusted a number. He moved on. And I sat across from him and understood, with the specific clarity that arrives when someone finally shows you exactly who they are, that the man I had been planning a future with had just told me that watching me survive on $200 a month while he saved $4,000 was not a problem he recognized as a problem. It was just math. And I was just a variable. Ryan and I had been together for 2 years before I moved into his apartment. We had met at a mutual friend's dinner, the kind of meeting that feels like it was arranged rather than accidental, and the early months were everything the early months are supposed to be. He was smart, stable, funny in the dry way that takes a moment to land but lands hard when it does. He had a career in finance that he wore lightly, which I found attractive because men who wear their success lightly tend, in my experience, to be more secure than men who wear it loudly. I was wrong about this. What I had mistaken for lightness was indifference, and indifference and lightness look identical from the outside until you are living inside the consequences of one of them. I make $45,000 a year. I am a primary school teacher. I chose the work deliberately, with full understanding of what it paid and why I wanted to do it anyway, and I have never been embarrassed about the number. Ryan makes $180,000 a year in finance. I knew this before we moved in together. He knew what I made before we moved in together. We had the money conversation, the one couples are supposed to have, and it was brief and surface level, and I had assumed the surface level was fine because I had not yet understood that the surface level was the only level Ryan intended to have the conversation on. The 50-50 arrangement was presented before I had fully unpacked. Not discussed. Presented. He had a spreadsheet, already built, with line items for rent, utilities, groceries, streaming subscriptions, and a miscellaneous category that he had already populated with estimated figures. Half for him, half for me. He walked me through it with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a system they are proud of, and I sat next to him looking at the numbers and felt something that I did not examine properly in that moment, which was the specific discomfort of something being decided for you while being framed as something being shared with you. I said it seemed like a lot on my end. He said it was exactly half, which was fair, and that fairness was important to him in relationships. I said okay. I should not have said okay. But he had framed it as fairness, and I did not yet have the language to explain why equal is not always the same as fair, and I did not push back, and that moment of not pushing back cost me 14 months of financial survival dressed up as a relationship. Here is what the math looked like after taxes. Ryan took home approximately $9,000 a month. Our shared expenses came to $2,600 split 2 ways, $1,300 each. Ryan's contribution left him with $7,700 a month for personal spending, savings, investment, whatever he chose. I took home approximately $3,000 a month. My $1,300 contribution left me with $1,700. Out of that $1,700 I paid for my own phone, my own transport, my own clothing, my own toiletries, my own lunches, any medical expense, any personal need, any participation in a social life. By the end of most months I had approximately $200 remaining. Some months less. Ryan, in the same months, had accumulated closer to $4,000 in personal savings. We were splitting the bills equally. We were not living equally. We were not even living in the same financial reality. I told myself it was temporary. That is the first lie I told myself, that I maintained it for longer than I should have. I told myself I would get a raise, that the arrangement would be revisited when my income changed, that Ryan was not doing anything wrong exactly, and that the discomfort was mine to manage while I worked toward a better financial position. I told myself this while I stopped going to dinners with friends because I could not afford my share of the bill. While I bought less food than I wanted because the grocery split meant I was contributing to a cart that reflected his appetite and his preferences more than mine. While I wore the same 4 pairs of shoes for 8 months because I could not justify the cost of new ones. While I sat across from a man who ordered wine without looking at the price and split the restaurant bill down the middle and did not notice that the split was not the same thing as equal in any real sense. My friend Dani noticed before I let myself notice. Dani had known me for 12 years, and she had the specific access that 12-year friendships grant, which is the access to say things without extensive preamble. She said it at brunch, 4 months into the arrangement, looking at me carefully, choosing the second cheapest thing on the menu while Ryan was not present. She said, "Are you doing okay financially?" I said yes. She said, "Because you seem like you're counting things." I said the arrangement was just a transition period while I adjusted to city expenses. She said okay and did not push, and I changed the subject and internally noted that I needed to be less visibly careful around Dani because her noticing made the thing more real than I was ready for it to be. 6 months in, Ryan's friend group started planning a birthday trip for him. An international trip, 4 nights, the kind of thing that costs real money. The assumption, communicated without explicit discussion, was that I would come. The cost per person was $1,900 for flights and accommodation alone, not including food and activities. I had $800 in my personal account. I told Ryan I was not sure I could afford the trip. He looked at me with genuine surprise, the kind of surprise that told me he had not run the numbers of my life with any of the precision he applied to our shared spreadsheet, and he said it was not that much. I said it was more than I had available. He said he could not tell his friends I was not coming. I said I needed him to hear what I was actually saying. He said he would think about it. He did not offer to help. He thought about it for 2 days and came back with a suggestion that I look into whether my credit card had a travel offer. I went on the trip. I put $1,900 on a credit card that took me 6 months to pay off while continuing to contribute $1,300 a month to the household. I smiled in every photograph. I drank less than everyone else. I calculated every meal against the remaining balance of a credit card with a limit I was actively consuming. I came home from my boyfriend's birthday trip more financially depleted than I had been when I left, and I did not say any of this out loud because I had been managing the reality of this arrangement in private for long enough that managing it had become a habit. The conversation happened at month 14. First of the month, spreadsheet open, the usual ritual. I looked at the numbers and I thought about the credit card I had just finished paying off. I thought about Dani at brunch. I thought about the shoes I had been wearing for 8 months. And I asked him if he thought this was fair. He said fairness was about equality and equal meant half. I looked at him across the table and I said, very carefully, "Ryan, you save $4,000 a month under this arrangement. I have $200 left over. Does that feel equal to you?" He said the savings difference was a function of income difference and that income difference was not something the household arrangement should compensate for. I said I was not asking the household arrangement to make us equal. I was asking whether an arrangement that left one partner with $200 a month while the other saved $4,000 was something he considered fair. He said fair and comfortable were different things. He said he could not be responsible for the choices I had made about my career. He said he had built his income through specific decisions and he did not think it was reasonable for a relationship to require him to subsidize a different set of decisions. Subsidize. He used the word subsidize. For the cost of $1,200 a month, which would have left us both with meaningful personal finances, he used the word subsidize. As though contributing proportionally to a shared life was charity. As though the difference between us was a personal failing of mine that he was being asked to financially absorb. As though the woman sitting across from him, who had been surviving on $200 a month for 14 months while he saved $4,000, was describing a desire for subsidy rather than a desire for a partnership that reflected both of their realities. I closed my laptop. I did not say anything. I sat in the quiet for a moment and thought about the word subsidize and what it meant that he had reached for it so quickly, with so little apparent awareness of how it would land, which meant it was not a word he had chosen carefully. It was a word he had been thinking. A word that had been sitting in his understanding of our arrangement for possibly the entire time, the word that explained why the system was what it was. He did not see a partner. He saw someone whose income was a personal variable that was not his concern, and the arrangement we had been living inside for 14 months had been designed, consciously or not, to reflect exactly that. I said I needed to think about some things. He said okay and looked back at the spreadsheet. He closed one column and opened another. He kept doing the math. I sat across from him and understood that the math was the point. The math had always been the point. And I was not in the math. That night I called Dani. I told her everything. Not the curated version. Everything. The $200. The credit card. The shoes. The trip. The word subsidize. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "I noticed at brunch." I said I knew. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said I did not know yet. She said whatever I decided she was there. I said I knew that too. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark next to a man who was already asleep, who had closed the spreadsheet and moved on because for him the conversation had been ordinary, had been the first of the month conversation we always had contained nothing alarming. For him it had been math. For me it had been a door opening onto a room I had been standing in for 14 months without the light on, and now the light was on, and I could see every corner of the room clearly for the first time, And what I saw in the corners was the shape of a relationship I had been calling a partnership, and that had never been a partnership at all. I spent 3 days doing nothing visible. Going to work, coming home, sitting at the table where the spreadsheet lived, behaving in every external way like a person who had processed a difficult conversation and moved forward. What I was actually doing was building a case with the same precision Ryan applied to his columns and rows, because I had understood something in the silence after the word subsidize, which was that feeling wronged was not going to be sufficient. Ryan operated in numbers. If I was going to have the real conversation, I needed numbers. I made a document. 14 months of the arrangement laid out in a format he would recognize. Total contributed by me, $18,200. Total personal funds remaining after contribution, averaged across 14 months, $2,940. Total personal funds remaining for Ryan after contribution across the same period, $107,800. The ratio of his personal remainder to mine, 36:1. For every dollar I had available for personal use over 14 months, he had 36. We had been splitting the bills equally. We had not been living equally by any measure that a reasonable person would apply to the word equal. I added a second section. The credit card. $1,900, accrued interest across 6 months of repayment, total cost to me, $2,112. Trip cost to Ryan from personal funds, $1,900. His trips to his financial reality, a rounding error. My trip to my financial reality, 2 months of personal spending capacity wiped out and then some. I added a third section. What a proportional arrangement would have looked like. If we had split shared expenses at a 33% to 67% ratio, reflecting our approximate income difference, my monthly contribution would have been approximately $860 rather than $1,300. Over 14 months that would have saved me $6,140. I would have had approximately $940 of personal money each month instead of $200. I would have been able to go to dinner with Dani without counting the menu. I would have bought shoes. I printed it. 3 pages. I set it on the kitchen table on a Sunday morning next to his coffee and I sat down across from him and I said I wanted to have a conversation. He looked at the papers and then at me and something in his expression changed in a way I had not seen before, a slight recalibration, the expression of someone who has just understood that the terrain has shifted and has not yet determined how to navigate the shift. He read the document. All 3 pages. Without speaking. I waited. When he finished he set the pages down and he said, "You've been thinking about this for a while?" I said yes. He said, "This is a lot of work to do to make a point." I said it was not a point. It was the arrangement we had been living in, documented. He said he was not sure what I was asking for. I said I was asking for a conversation about whether the arrangement reflected a partnership or a contract, and whether he understood the difference. He said the arrangement was transparent and agreed upon. I said I had agreed to something I did not fully understand the impact of, and that understanding something in theory and experiencing it across 14 months were different things, and that I was asking him to look at the experience rather than just the theory. He said he had built his career on the principle that personal financial responsibility was not transferable, and that he did not think that principle changed in a relationship. I said I was not asking him to be responsible for my finances. I was asking whether the arrangement we had built was one that a person who loved me would look at and consider acceptable. The word love did something. Not a dramatic something. A small shift. He looked at the document again. He looked at the column that said 36:1. He was quiet for a moment that was different from his usual quiet, less settled, more like something working. And then he said, "I didn't think about it that way." I said I knew. I said I believed him. I said that was actually the thing that worried me most, not that he had built a system designed to disadvantage me, but that he had built it without thinking about what it meant for me, and had maintained it for 14 months without noticing the 36:1 ratio, and had called my concern about it a desire for subsidy without registering how that word would land on someone who had been surviving on $200 a month. He said he needed time to think. I said okay. I said I needed him to understand that time to think was fine and that time to think that ended in the same spreadsheet was not something I could continue. He said he heard me. He looked like he was somewhere between the person who had said subsidize without thinking and someone different, and I did not know yet which one was real and which one had been the performance. He came back 2 days later with a counterproposal. A proportional split based on income. The numbers were not exactly what my document had shown, but they were in the direction of proportional, which was in the direction of reality, which was more than I had gotten in 14 months. I looked at the numbers. They would leave me with approximately $800 of personal money each month instead of $200. Not wealthy. Livable. The difference between counting menus and not counting menus. The difference between shoes. I said I needed to know something before I decided whether the new numbers were enough. I said I needed to know whether the 14 months had been a choice he had made without thinking about its impact on me, or a choice he had made because he did not care about its impact on me. He said it was the former. I said I needed him to understand that the former was also a problem, because not thinking about the impact of your choices on your partner was not neutral. Neutral would have been thinking about it and not seeing the problem. Not thinking about it at all meant I had not been in the calculation. And if I had not been in the calculation for 14 months, I needed to understand whether that was something that could change or whether it was structural. He did not answer immediately. The not answering immediately was its own answer, in the way that certain silences are. And I sat with that silence and I thought about Dani at brunch and the shoes and the credit card and the word subsidize, and I let the silence tell me what it was telling me. I moved out 6 weeks later. Not because he was a monster. I want to be clear about that because this story has a villain-shaped space in it and I do not want to fill it with something inaccurate. He was not a monster. He was a man who had built a life organized around a principle, that personal financial outcomes were the result of personal choices and were therefore personal responsibilities, and that principle had been applied to a relationship without modification, without the adjustment that love is supposed to produce, the adjustment that makes you look at the person across from you and ask not just what is equal but what is enough for both of us to be okay. He had never asked that question. In 14 months he had never looked at the spreadsheet and asked whether $200 a month was enough for me to be okay. That was not cruelty. It was something in some ways harder to address than cruelty, which was indifference, structural indifference, the indifference of someone who has organized their life so efficiently around their own framework that other people's frameworks simply do not compute. Dani helped me move. She did not say anything significant on moving day. She carried boxes and ordered us food and put on music, and at the end of the day when the new small apartment had enough of my things in it to be livable she hugged me and said, "You look like you can breathe." I said I could. She said that was enough for today. It was. The new apartment cost me $850 a month in a neighborhood that is smaller and further from the center than the one I left. I pay it alone, entirely, and I have $1,500 remaining after rent and bills. $1,500 that belong entirely to me, that I spend without consulting a spreadsheet, that I allocate according to my own priorities, which have turned out to include new shoes and dinner with Dani without counting the menu and occasionally a bottle of wine that costs more than $12 because I can and because I want to and because nobody is going to open a column and divide it. I bought the shoes first. That is the thing I did before anything else when I had real money again, before I bought a new plant or a good pillow or anything else the new apartment needed. I bought shoes. Stood in the store and chose them without doing the math of whether I could afford them and whether the math of affording them would affect the spreadsheet and whether the spreadsheet would need to be updated and whether the update would produce a conversation about responsibility and equality and the choices I had made about my career. I just bought the shoes. And I walked out of the store and stood on the pavement in my new shoes in my new financial reality and felt something I had been telling myself I was feeling for 14 months but had not actually been feeling, which was okay. Just okay. Livable. Enough. Here is what I learned that I want you to hear. Equal is not the same as fair and fair is not the same as equal, and a person who does not understand the difference will not learn the difference from a spreadsheet. They will learn it from a question, if they are capable of learning it at all, and the question is not complicated. The question is whether the arrangement you have built is one that you would accept if you were the other person living inside it. That is all. That is the whole question. Can you look at what you have created and honestly say, if the positions were reversed, I would be okay in this? Ryan could not answer that question. Not because he was asked it and refused. Because when I finally asked it, when I finally created the space for the question in plain numbers on 3 printed pages, the silence that followed told me that he had never asked it of himself, had never run the numbers from my side of the spreadsheet, had never sat with $200 a month and imagined it as the whole of his personal financial reality. He had just done the math. And the math had always been for one. If you are sitting across from someone's spreadsheet right now, if you are counting the menu and calling it your financial responsibility, if you are about to put $1,900 on a credit card because your partner cannot tell his friends you are not coming, I need you to do one thing before you do anything else. Ask the question. Is this fair? Not loudly. Not with a document. Just the question, plain and direct, across whatever table you are sitting at. And then listen to the answer. Not the words. The answer underneath the words. The one that arrives before they have time to choose the right ones. The one that tells you everything you actually need to know about whether you are in a partnership or a variable in someone else's equation. The answer will tell you whether you need different numbers or a different table entirely. I needed a different table. The shoes are excellent. And I bought them alone.